everyone, and welcome back. I'm Teresa Blondin, the manager of volunteers and community programs for Bladder Cancer Canada. Tonight is the final session for patients and caregivers in the series Access to Medications. I hope you're all feeling pretty empowered at this point. There is one more session next week. It's specifically for healthcare professionals. It's sharing your professional experience and empowering patients and caregivers. You are welcome to attend this session. However, you may feel some of the material is redundant after listening to today's session. So tonight's session is telling your personal story and using your advocacy tools. It will take a deeper dive into how to become an advocate, teaching you how to create your story and get your voice heard. Thank you again to the team at Eversana who graciously provided us with these webinars and all of the time and effort that went into these. So today's presenter will be Joanne Koskie. Joanne works with Ryan Clark as Vice President of Advocacy and PR at Eversana. So I am so happy to welcome Joanne to present us with telling your personal story and using your advocacy tools.
Great, thanks so much, Teresa. I hope everybody can hear me okay. Hey everyone, there's a great crowd with us tonight, which is fantastic to see. As Teresa said, we're in the final stretch of the advocacy series and we have covered so much ground. So I can only imagine how everybody must be feeling right now. Brains very full. So thank you so much for your engagement thus far. So picking up where Ryan left off, for the next 45 minutes, we'll be talking about how to effectively tell your personal story in the context of advocacy and how to use the advocacy tools you have at your disposal. And I'm going to go off camera now because just to allow you to focus on these slides and not on me. So in this presentation, you'll be happy to see here on your screen that we'll be talking about something that you are all experts in, and that is your personal stories. And you'll each be getting a copy of our how-to guide to telling your personal story after or perhaps even during this webinar. And in that guide, you'll find all of the information that we're going to cover in this session and more. So here on your screen is a quick overview of what we'll be covering tonight in this first part of the webinar. So let's jump in because we've got lots to talk about. So as Ryan explained last week, for those of you who were on that webinar, personal stories are one of the two pillars of effective advocacy. And so as you can guess, honing your ability to tell your personal story is very important in this work that you are about to embark on. Now, you may be wondering, in advocacy, what exactly is a personal story? Well, in face-to-face meetings or virtual or in person, or in written communication with a decision maker, your personal story really helps to make your issue come to life. It makes your issue real for the decision maker and provides a point of connection, very important point of connection between the two of you. And if properly developed and delivered, and those are two different things that we'll be talking about, your personal story should fuel the logic of your one ask, as Ryan spoke about during the previous webinar. And importantly, it should be emotional, which we underscore does not mean sad, but it should help to motivate and guide the decision maker to do what you need them to do for you. On this slide, you see the 4 essential elements that we feel should be included in the context of all personal stories that are written for the purpose of advocacy. So let's take a look at each one of these in detail. The objective in this first section of your personal story is to establish a picture of who you are and to convey to the decision maker that I'm like you, I go to work, I have a family, I'm raising my kids or grandkids, etc. So these are the basic personal details that we suggest that you share right off the top. Next is the point in your story that you transition from setting the stage to the circumstances that have brought you to today, the advocacy work that you're doing. And your diagnosis or an issue with your health is typically that point when we talk about advocacy in the context of diseases. This is also the first opportunity in most personal stories to start opening up about your feelings, which, as I mentioned just earlier, is critical to enable you to connect with the decision maker. That's that emotional connection. Next, you need to transition from the fact of your diagnosis to the issue at hand. In other words, if you had a health issue, you entered into the healthcare system to have it resolved, and everything went absolutely perfectly for you and everyone else with that disease and the same issue, you presumably wouldn't need to do any advocacy at all. Why? Because nothing would need to change. So this is where you need to talk about the challenges you've had as it relates to the issue at hand. You're going to hear that expression quite often. If the issue is access to medications, for example, as it so often is in the work that we do with patient groups, don't focus on the prolonged time it may have taken you to get to a diagnosis. You can mention all of the challenges that you face, but focus on the one that is linked to the issue that you're there to resolve with your decision maker. And lastly, your one ask. The action that you need the decision maker to take as a result of what you've just shared with them in the first half of your personal story. So now that you know the essential elements of your personal story, let's talk about actually getting started by, surprise, surprise, starting to write or type. And we suggest that you do that by considering one or more of the strategies on this slide. So we have free writing, we have listing, we have using photographs, and asking questions. There are also a few general tips that we share right off the bat that may help you to get started. Number one, don't aim for a polished story right away. These getting started strategies are about letting your mind wander through possible versions of your story. And that means that you don't even need to start at the beginning, which is good news. You can start really anywhere you want. Don't worry about correct spelling, punctuation, or grammar at this stage, which is hard for many of us to do, and that'll just hold you back. So just write. It'll all get cleaned up in the end. And keep in mind that you'll be sharing your story with a decision maker eventually, but when you're getting started, write for yourself. That's really important because you really want to write to learn what you're thinking and feeling and what you deem to be most important about your story. For many people, this is the first time that you're doing this. So you need, to really give yourself a chance. Sorry, I just realized there we go. Free writing is next, and that is really writing to discover what you're thinking you have to say. And in this case, what you want to tell others about your issue. And on this slide are some suggestions that you may find helpful if you choose this particular getting started strategy. When you read what you've written after you've taken this free writing approach with fresh eyes the next day, a few things that we're going to suggest that you look for. Some ideas or sentiments that you've maybe repeated, because those can be themes that you can pull out into your personal story. Descriptions or ideas or feelings that maybe surprise you that you might want to build upon. And then connections between any ideas or events or experiences that you may have not thought about previously. Next is listing. Listing can really be an effective way to discover ideas or to pin them down. The process, as you can see on this slide, is like making a shopping list. You write down laundry detergent, for example, and then suddenly you remember that you have to pick up the dry cleaning. That happens to me all the time. You might start by listing all the challenges that you faced since your diagnosis. And in that list, you might discover one that stands out as most relevant to your issue or most powerfully supports your one ask. Some other examples of things you might list to get started could include the biggest surprises, either pleasant or unpleasant, of your experience living with bladder cancer, or that your loved one has experienced. What people say most often to you when you tell them about your diagnosis, that can be helpful to add to your list. And the impacts on your life of government action, inaction, policies, lack of policies, and so forth that are related to your condition. So just a couple of suggestions as to how you can approach this listing strategy. Another getting started strategy that we recommend is using photographs, which can really be excellent storytelling tools. Just look to virtual social media platforms like Instagram, where photos are everything. If you're going to use photos and telling your personal story, you really need to explain why each photo is significant. And again, this is going to help you to develop your story. For example, what was happening to you at the time the photo was taken? How did you feel? If there are others in the photos, it's important to remember how they felt. And remember that we said that your personal story should be emotional, and using photos will absolutely help to bring that out. We all know that when we look at photographs, they evoke many, many emotions as we remember what happened at that time. And the good news is you can use these photos in your meetings with your advocacy targets as well. We'll talk about that in just a moment. So the last strategy is asking and answering questions. So you're probably familiar with the fundamental questions that a journalist or a reporter asks when they're developing a news story. Who, what, when, where, why, and how. And so just as journalists ask these questions that are appropriate to their task to report on what happened, who made it happen, how it happened, and so on, you can also use this approach to formulate questions that will help you to get to your story. And of course, you need to answer these questions you pose. So you can kind of think about it as interviewing yourself for a news story. So let's say you've tried one or more of these getting started strategies and you're still stuck. So how do you overcome writer's block? One thing you can do, it sounds really obvious, but take a break. Sometimes a break is all you need to cure that writer's block. Secondly, it's important to remember that you don't need to worry about finding the perfect words, the perfect grammar and spelling, like I mentioned earlier at this point. Just write, just let yourself go. And number three, and I find this very helpful, tell your story to a friend or explain to them where you're stuck, and they might be able to help you get over that. So next, let's move on to polishing your personal story now that you've completed writing it by taking the steps that you see here on this slide. Really, the best way to tell your story to prepare to tell your story to a decision maker is to read your story out loud, either alone or to a friend or a family member. But it's important to understand that reading in your head is not the same thing as reading your story out loud or having someone read it out loud for you. So just to give you an example, in preparing for this webinar tonight, I read my presentation out loud at least 2 times, and that really helps me to, become more comfortable with the information that I'm sharing. And as you read, it's important to really watch for spots in your story where you tend to ad lib, like I just did. We all do it. And it's where you improvise and add material that isn't written in your story. And what can happen is, it can really slow you down, and resisting this urge to improvise and add to your written story once you're at a point where you're happy with it is a really important thing to be able to do. And when you read your story out loud, you should always time yourself. Another thing that I did tonight to make sure that I didn't run over. And know that you almost never have more than about 5 minutes, more likely 2 to 3 with a decision maker. So adjust accordingly. But you also don't want to be too brief. You have to really find that happy medium and make sure that you can take your time without having to rush. Now, this slide is going to come to as a relief to many of you. For people first learning to present their personal stories for the very first time, we're not only recommending that you don't memorize it, but we're suggesting that you consider reading it word for word for all of the reasons that we've noted on this slide. With practice, you'll know where to add the emphasis that you need to make it sound more natural to the decision makers. But certainly in the beginning, absolutely no problem with reading your personal story out to a decision maker. And as you become more comfortable with it, the more meetings that you do, the more opportunities you have, you probably won't need to read it as much anymore. But if you do, that is not a problem. And finally, our last little piece of advice while you rehearse telling your personal story is to stay focused. Now, this seems obvious and easy to do, but it can be challenging if you're advocating to someone who likes to interrupt or is not a good listener. We've all had those experiences. And so to help you stay focused, we've come up with something that we call the 5-minute story challenge, just on here on the next slide. This challenge is simple. If you cannot convey your story effectively in 5 minutes, ask yourself the questions that you see here and make the changes that you need to tighten up your story. Now, this checklist and everything else that I'm talking about is going to be in the how-to guide, so no worries, you'll have it. You should know that in our experience, almost no one gets their personal story down to the essential elements delivered in 5 minutes on the first or even the second try. But if you keep trying, you will absolutely get there, we promise. And to conclude this part, you'll find this handy checklist in your how-to guide to help you confirm that you have been successful in your efforts to put together your personal story. And so we absolutely encourage you to use it. Now, let's shift gears to focus on how to use some advocacy tools to help you to share your carefully honed personal story that you've spent so much time working on. If you joined our webinar last week, you'll recall that Ryan walked through the whole 5-step process to developing effective advocacy plans. But in particular, we're looking tonight at the 5th step, which is choosing your tools and targets. You'll also recall that Ryan explained that advocacy tools are the means of delivering the messages that you've developed. And there are 3 steps which we believe must be followed regardless of the tool that you are using to get to the point where you're ready to take action and bring about tangible change. So that's educate, demonstrate, and advocate. And these 3 steps are very much aligned with how we develop advocacy key messages, if you remember from the last webinar: the problem, the solution, and the call to action. So everything connects. Ryan reviewed this slide during the last webinar, but as a reminder, or for those of you who weren't able to participate, we don't just throw every single advocacy tool at the decision maker, and certainly not all at the same time. You really need to select the tools that you think the decision maker will be most receptive and responsive to, and the ones that will elicit the most pressure at the appropriate time. And if you recall last week, Ryan shared a couple of slides that had a wide array of advocacy tools. And to build upon that, the timing of when you use your tools is very important. So let's discuss that just for a minute. Their use really should create what we call a layering effect, one on top of another over time. And that really takes planning. That means you're being very strategic in how you use these tools. So be aware of the timing of other activities, events, or milestones happening around you that may influence when you decide to use a tool. For example, and this is going to happen to us soon in Ontario, in the lead up to an election, you may want to start using Twitter a whole lot more in your advocacy work, because elected officials, certainly candidates in pre-election mode, pay very close attention to Twitter. And finally, on this slide, giving the decision maker a chance to engage in your issue and respond to your ask through a specific tool may have an impact on your timing decision as well. So you may want to wait a little longer until you use your next tool, because you want to give your decision maker an opportunity to do what you need them to do. So here's an example of how to layer advocacy tools. You'll notice that some tools can be used earlier, like in the first layer, later, like in the third layer, or even more than once in your advocacy work. And the timing really depends on the objective of using the tool. And if the messaging has changed since the first time that you started using that tool. Now, of course, not all tools are included on this slide. As I mentioned before, you saw a whole bunch of them last week. And we don't really have enough time to go through even the ones that are here, but we will walk you through 2 tools in particular that you'll likely have an opportunity to use as soon as you are ready to start in your advocacy work. So let's start with one of the most impactful tools in advocacy, and that is in-person meetings, or in today's COVID world, virtual meetings that you may have with your advocacy targets. On this slide, you can see the first steps to preparing for that meeting. And with respect to who will be attending the meeting, even if it's by phone, which is still done sometimes, it's important that you are not alone. And we'll talk about the different roles that people can play in meetings in a moment. But really what's most important, especially if you're meeting with politicians, which you likely will be, is that at least one person participating in the meeting should have a personal story to tell about how the issue is affecting them. And typically in the work that we do, that is the patient or a caregiver. Now, when you've decided to get a meeting, you have to understand that no, being told no, is not an option. You need to decide going into this exercise, I will not give up until I get my meeting. So at the same time, you need to be realistic about who you need to meet with to minimize your frustration and disappointment. If you set your sights on meeting with the Minister of Health, and in reality, that is going to be a very challenging thing for you to do, better to think about somebody else, like perhaps your local elected official. We suggest that you make an initial telephone call, or you can send an email, but it's always great, more personal touch to make a phone call, and have an email prepared afterwards that briefly outlines why you want to meet with that person. And then the mantra at this point is follow up, follow up, follow up. So this is your meeting. If you really want it, it's your responsibility to pursue it. And you sometimes have to be very, very persistent. If you're offered the chance to meet with someone else other than your target, understand that this is not an alternative in most cases. But we will suggest to you that you should take that meeting with that person, because it will enable you to continue to pursue the actual decision maker, and at the same time, maybe build a relationship with someone who is close to that person. Now, before the meeting, it's important that you provide any information that you want the decision maker to read well ahead of time. Now, this is something that if you're advocating with an organization like BCC, they might be able to help you with. And it is not unreasonable to assume that the decision maker will not have read the material, especially if they're a politician. They're busy, they're dealing with many, many issues. So never assume they have. And if in doubt, the best thing to do is at the top of your meeting, just ask them if they've had an opportunity to peruse the information that you shared with them. Now, the material you provide should be brief, it should be simple, and it should absolutely deliver your 3 key messages and your 1 ask, as Ryan explained last week. Now, keep in mind that you are competing with every other person and every other organization that elected official is meeting with. So you've got to be impactful, and usually in a very short period of time. And speaking of time, it's also good to know that in advance how long the meeting is scheduled for. And always plan for it to be shorter, as we mentioned earlier, so you are sure to cover everything you want to discuss and you're able to share your personal story in a reasonable time frame. Now let's discuss a question that we often get from advocates. Who specifically should attend the meeting? As you see here on this slide, we suggest that 3 to 4 people at the most attend, and that's including you. But what you need to do is make sure that everyone who is there has a reason for being there. And one of which could be to take notes, for example, because when you're in the thick of it and you're telling your personal story and it's all happening, you're not necessarily hearing what the person you're meeting with is saying to you or asking you. And everyone really should know why they're there, and that is to talk about the issue at hand and not something else. So many of us are dealing with different health issues in particular, but whoever is with you needs to understand that this meeting is to talk about the particular issue that you're dealing with. And ideally, you want to have people at the meeting with you who can paint a complete picture of the issue that you're facing from a few different perspectives, which is why it's great if you're a patient to have a caregiver there, or a friend or a colleague, anybody who you think can help enlighten the person you're meeting with from that different perspective. Now, what about after the meeting? So you've done it, you were persistent, you got your meeting, you had your meeting, it went well, you've put so much effort into all of your advocacy work so far, and it's really important at this stage to try and stay top of mind following that initial meeting with your decision maker. This may not be the only meeting you have with this person, and if that's the case, then you're just going to want to stay in their sights. So don't forget to send a thank you note right after the meeting, which should recount the tangible commitments that you've agreed to. Now, that they've agreed to. This is really important. And you do this partly to help you stay top of mind, as I mentioned, but also, even more importantly, to create a record that gives you something to refer back to if needed. So basically, if you have this meeting, if your elected official commits to helping you with the issue, it's fantastic to be able to reiterate that in an email. And then if you don't hear back from them, you can refer back to that email and say, as you mentioned, you need to do this, you agreed to do this. So if you think it's something that your decision maker will respond to, you can also try tweeting your thanks and tagging others as appropriate to add some extra pressure. Again, this makes your thanks a little bit more public, and that can often help to prompt a decision maker. And it's important if you're working with an organization like BCC that you tag them in a tweet if you decide to go this route. And just to finish off this part, here you can see some tips for in-person meetings that are good to keep in mind also for virtual meetings. And if you remember nothing else from this section, remember this. Effective advocacy is about three things: presenting, listening, and responding. Listening in a meeting is so important. If you hear yourself talking continuously, stop, because we do that, especially when we're nervous. And this is why you should not do that, because if you don't stop or pause, you're making it too easy for the decision maker by letting them get away without having to say anything, and therefore not addressing your key messages, or in particular, your one ask. Now, let's move on to two more tools that we have available to us in advocacy. Almost at the end. Now, in advocacy, going to traditional news media or social media with your story or your issue really serves to expand and ultimately amplify the conversation that you're going to have, or that you did have, with your elected official, your target, from a one-to-one conversation that's private to one-to-one to many, and that's bringing it into the public domain. And doing this can really put added pressure on the decision maker, as I mentioned before, making a private issue public. Also, you'll want to consider which media outlet will be the most interested in your story. And that could change as your story evolves from, let's say, a community-based issue that only affects you to a broader issue that impacts people like you all across your province, or even all across the country. So different media outlets will be interested at different stages of the evolution. And finally, you should also consider when the best time is to go to the media. And this is part of layering, as we discussed earlier. But don't worry, we absolutely know that being interviewed is not for everyone. And if it isn't for you, then consider sharing your story through social media instead. Almost done. Just gonna do a little time check. Okay. So if you do decide to take your story to the media, understand that this is not usually your first step. or in your first layer, in how you use your advocacy tools. But if it is, it should only be because you are either laying the foundation for your advocacy work through awareness, raising awareness, educating, or there is an urgency around your ask. So in many cases, this can be a medication that is critical for patients to have as soon as possible. And then understandably, you would go to the media as fast as you can. Secondly, you want to take your story to the media only after you have gone directly to the decision maker and have given them a chance to help. We talked about this a little bit earlier. Reporters that you talk to about this issue are going to ask if you've done this. It's going to be one of the first things they're going to say to you. And if you haven't, they're going to want to know why you haven't gone to your decision maker first before taking your story public. And again, if this is an urgent issue, they'll understand, maybe why you haven't had a chance to do that. And you can always tell them that you're going to be talking to the decision maker at the same time, that you needed to bring it to the public's attention quickly. Also keep in mind that if the person that you're advocating to is not the ultimate decision maker, they may be willing to engage with the media alongside you. So this is like your local elected official, MPP, MLA, and they are not the Minister of Health or even in the governing party, they will very often agree to talk to the media and basically advocate alongside you. We've seen this happen time and time again. So don't be afraid to ask. You never know. They could say yes. They like to be in the public eye. They like to be seen as helping their constituents. And finally, as I mentioned, you need to give the decision maker the chance to do their job. But if they are taking too long and they need another push, then you have reached layer 3 on that diagram that you saw earlier. And you can absolutely go back to the media, but with updated key messages to reflect where you're at in your advocacy efforts, because things can change along the way. Now we're going to talk about e-advocacy. And in the past, advocacy was limited to real world encounters and tangible activities, like I just mentioned, meetings, doing interviews, that kind of thing. But today, the internet has opened up endless channels for advocacy, making it entirely possible for more people to engage than ever before. We talk about grassroots advocacy. That's exactly what we mean. And e-advocacy in particular is really a spectrum of activities or actions that vary in time and level of difficulty. And the challenge really here is converting passive support, which is quick and easy, to active engagement, which takes a little bit more time, but it really is the key to effective e-advocacy. You want people to do something that's a little bit more meaningful than liking a post on social media. And while e-advocacy can be extremely powerful and persuasive, taking action in the real world is still often considered the holy grail of advocacy. And that's why we spend so much time talking about meetings, for example, which even virtually is a high value real world action that can be really, really effective in advocacy. But for an advocacy campaign to be successful, we need a variety of activities to be taking place, including some that are high volume exercises. And that's where e-advocacy plays an important role. So thousands of people sending emails to elected officials across the country or the Minister of Health in a province is an example of that high volume activity. Now, there are so many different tools and channels that you can use in e-advocacy, and you can see some of them here on this slide. We've got Facebook, we've got Twitter, we have Instagram, LinkedIn, emails, websites, blogs, you name it. There's so many opportunities for e-advocacy and so many tools that we can use. But again, it's really important to consider your audience when deciding what e-advocacy tools to use, both in terms of the impact and the shareability of the content. And simply by changing the tone or the content of the key messages, like I mentioned before, e-advocacy tools can absolutely be layered in at almost every stage of an advocacy campaign, as you've seen. And that is all the time I think we have today to talk about personal stories and the most commonly used advocacy tools. But I am very, very happy to answer any questions that you may have in the time remaining.
Well, thank you so much, Joanne. You really broke down the process into clear steps and so many useful tips, how to, craft our story and find the target. The series has been so informative. We're truly grateful to you and to Ryan, such great expertise. So thank you. We'll open it up for some questions. Again, you can use the chat if you prefer, or you can use the raise hand function, and then I can unmute you and you can ask your question live, whatever you prefer.
I'll kick things off if that's all right with everyone here. What do I do if someone other than my advocacy target offers me a meeting? Should I take it?
Absolutely, it's a great question, and we do get this question very often in the work that we do and the work that we support, and the answer really generally is yes. It's great to have an opportunity to get in there and meet with someone as long as they're sort of connected to your ultimate target. It also gives you a great opportunity to, practice delivering your personal story and your key messages, but it also might provide you with an opportunity to get close to, build a relationship with, someone who is also close to your ultimate, decision maker. So, we would definitely say take, every opportunity you can get. I mean, an example of this would be, if you're looking to have a meeting with a minister, they're busy people. And so if there is a staff person in that minister's office who's offering you a meeting instead of the minister themselves, go for it. Absolutely take the opportunity. Great question.
Okay, great. And there's a question in the chat as well. I'm a caregiver for someone living with bladder cancer. Can I develop a personal story?
Yeah, that's another really, really frequently asked question. We get it quite a bit. Caregivers are so important in this process of advocacy. We can't underestimate, the value of a caregiver telling the story, about this particular, patient individual from their own perspective. So either way, you can go into a meeting with a personal story from the patient's perspective and the caregiver's perspective, or you could simply, have the personal story told from the caregiver's perspective if that's the situation you're in. So either, both, they're all so powerful and important to bring into the work that you're doing.
Okay, and then I thought of something. I know, these experiences can be, there's a lot in them. So what if someone's personal story was longer than 5 minutes? Could they send that maybe in a written version, or do you really recommend you keep it to 5?
Yeah, that's another good question. And this is a huge challenge. We have supported so many patients and caregivers, loved ones, to develop their personal stories. And it really can be very challenging to sort of get it down to that 5-minute mark. So what we would say is, you can develop a couple of different versions of your personal story. One that is sort of 5 minutes or even a little shorter, that you'll have ready to share during a meeting. But then if you have one that's a little bit longer, absolutely feel free to share it with that decision maker or that advocacy target, separately, as when you follow up, for example. Thank you for meeting with me, and I just want to make sure that there was a lot to cover, and here's my personal story for you to read through at your leisure. Absolutely. Yeah, it's a great question. And one thing I'll say is, I think once everyone gets their how-to guide to telling your personal story, I mean, that's going to really, I think, shed light on the process and give you those really helpful tools and checklists, that you can use. But certainly, we're here, we're available to you, Ryan, myself, our colleague Rosalind. If you do go down this road and decide to tell your personal story and use the guide, we're here to help. So we'd be very, very happy to speak with anybody who decides to take on this challenge.
Okay, great. Well, there doesn't seem to be any questions. So I want to say a huge thank you to everyone again for attending, and an even larger thank you to Joanne, Ryan, and the team at Eversana. That this series was so educational and really, really empowering. I think we're now an army of advocates. So If you want to send any feedback or questions, feel free to do that at info@bladdercancercanada.org. And I hope you all have a great night.
Great. Thanks, everyone.